Good morning, it's still morning. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. And um, yeah, I just wanted to give you an update on the midterms. So Jeff and our TA team have been working really hard to mark your midterms, and they're almost done. So the grades will be released tomorrow. And if you have any questions at all or concerns about any questions or your mark or whatever, please see the TA or make an appointment with the TA who marked your exam. You all did very well. The average for the midterm is about 84%. So good for you. I'm very happy about that. I'm glad that you're getting a lot out of the course and it shows in your midterm. So thank you. Okay, so today uh, I'm going to continue on and finish the lecture that I didn't quite get to the end of lecture 11 on species interactions uh, last time. And then I'm going to talk about how does this play into our understanding of biodiversity, forest structure, and what we call habitat and niche. And this all plays into global change and climate change, which I'll explain. So here's our learning objectives for today from lecture 11. I'm going to, talk about, we've been talking about these two-way interactions between species, but really there's so many species that work together in a forest or in community that we often, we really need to think about these more complex interactions, which ecologists call higher order interactions, and how these interactions can lead to trophic cascades. And then I'll move on to talking about how species interactions are so important in biodiversity. And then I'm going to get into what is biodiversity. We hear this term all the time, but what does it really mean? And then why is it such an important driver? Or, why is it so closely tied to climate change and as part of global change? I'm going to have here's some very, you know, succinct learning objectives that will help you when you go to study for the final on this. I want you to be able to name the structural components of biodiversity, identify different levels of what we call compositional diversity, what we mean by architectural diversity and what the elements of that are, processes that contribute to this structural diversity. There's something called social structures or social diversity. We'll talk about that. I'm going to, define for you what we mean by habitat and niche, which are all part of this structural, architectural, and social diversity in forests. And then I'm going to kind of talk about this against the backdrop of what's happened at Fairy Creek. So Fairy Creek, if you will remember, it was a major site of civil disobedience in Canada in 2021. It was really, people coming together and saying, what's happening in forestry is affecting biodiversity, and it's not acceptable to us. So we'll talk a little bit about that story. Okay, so just to bring us back to the last lecture, what I was talking about was, that there are these different kinds of interactions in forests or relationships. There's many kinds. We often focus just on competition, and we design forest practices around alleviating competition all the time. That's our go-to guiding light when we're designing forest practices. But we often do that at the peril of these other kinds of interactions that are going on at the same time. So these include, positive interactions, which we call mutualisms, or positive negative interactions. So one species gaining, the other one losing, which is things like predation or parasitisms or pathologies. Those are also really important in forests. And then there's these other more little bit more obtuse kinds of interactions, commensalism, and that is where, one species is benefiting from the interaction, the other one doesn't even notice. And I've got these little icons I put in here. This one is of a beetle on a dung from a cow. And in this is a commensalism where the beetle is benefiting from the eating, living off the dung, and the cow that defecated doesn't even notice that the beetle is benefiting from it, at least in a direct way. And then there's another kind called amensalism, which is where one species is being negatively impacted and there's no impact on the other one. And I gave the example of walnut trees, which actually can shade out the neighboring plant and not even notice that it's shading out this little plant that's trying to establish in the understory, or emitting toxins, which is called allelopathy in biology. The walnut exudes these toxins, doesn't even notice that it doesn't harm it in any way, that it's killing off all the other plants that may be trying to establish in its understory. Okay, so in ecology, we tend to focus on these two-way interactions just because they're easy to study. But in fact, like I said, they're highly complex in nature. And so really what we're dealing with are what people, call higher order interactions. And higher order interactions is just that there are numerous interactions going on all at once, multiplicity of them in a forest. And even between two organisms, they're affected by other species that are interacting with them. Okay, and that's just because, nature is a highly connected, integrated, balanced system. So these higher order interactions, and just to put a definition on it, occurs when the interaction between two species is significantly altered or influenced by the presence of a third species. So, and I've given you this example, and let me explain this example to you. So in a forest, on the coastal rainforests of British Columbia, for example, these are all forests that are influenced by salmon. So there's rivers that run through these forests, and salmon spawn in those rivers, and then they go out to sea to carry out their most of their life cycle, and within in a 4-year cyclic period, they return to their natal streams where they were born, and they spawn and they die. It's a beautiful cycle and a beautiful integration of the land and the sea, and that the salmon are a vector that bring them together. And so when the salmon come back to their natal streams where they were born, they're carrying with them, obviously, they're full of protein. They are protein. And that protein, of course, has nitrogen in it. And nitrogen exists in many forms, but it's a key component of protein. As a salmon lives its life cycle out in the ocean, it actually accumulates an isotope of nitrogen called N15. It's the heavier isotope of N14, which is, the normal species of nitrogen that is in the atmosphere. Okay, so the heavier isotope means that when salmon ingest their prey, they're ingesting little bits of N15. It occurs naturally in our environment in very teensy tiny amounts. So it ingests this N15, and because N15 is a bigger molecule, the metabolic processes, when it's metabolizing the protein of its prey, it will accumulate that N15 in its body, right? Because the N15, because it's bigger, always gets left behind in a reaction. It always ends up accumulating in the flesh of the salmon. So the salmon becomes heavier and heavier in N15 isotope as it lives out its life cycle in the ocean. And so, okay, so then that N15 signature that's in the salmon can be used as a tracer. And what scientists have found is that when salmon returns to its natal stream, and people have found this N15, this salmon nutrient, actually in the trees. And so this is not just an interaction between the salmon and the tree, though, there are other species involved in that interaction. And it turns out that when the salmon return to their streams, of course, the people, especially the indigenous people along the coast, will fish or harvest those salmon, and then dry it and eat it in their food systems. It's an essential part of food systems of the coastal nations. And they end up, fertilizing some of the forest with salmon nutrients. But it's not just people. There's also wolves and bears and eagles that will pick up the salmon from their spawning grounds and carry it into the forest. And then the most of that salmon body is not eaten, it's left on the forest floor. And so then when it decays on the forest floor, it seeps into the soil, and the mycorrhizas of the trees pick up that salmon nutrient, or the N15, and deliver it into the trees. Okay, so the salmon actually ends up through these interactions, higher order interactions with bears, wolves, eagles, and people. The salmon interacts with the trees in that way. Okay, so that's a beautiful story of a cycle of a forest and how interconnected and how these higher order interactions really work. So, okay, so I have a polling question here. I've also got this other point. Interactions extend across ecosystem boundaries. So this is another, higher order actions do that. So this is a marine ecosystem interacting with a riparian ecosystem, which is a water, river ecosystems interacting with a forest ecosystem and aquatic ecosystem. And so they're, and it's extending through vast areas of the forest. Okay, so I have a polling question here, and that is, why are salmon effects on trees considered a higher order interaction? Okay, and here's the polling question.
Done. So like there's 50% chose E, 35% chose D, and remain chose ABC.
Okay, yeah, that's probably the hardest question I've given you so far. But yeah, so the answer is D. It's the result of multiple species interactions, and it's kind of interesting because everything that I said, A, B, and C is also true, but it's not what we define a higher order interaction. So I know that was a really hard question. Okay, so higher order actions can also result in what we call trophic cascades. This is such a beautiful term. I love that term, trophic cascade. What does that mean? And what I just described to you with the salmon is a trophic cascade as well. And a trophic cascade happens when there is an interaction, and here you can see three levels or three species that are interacting, A, B, and C. You can think of them as salmon, soil mycorrhizas, and the trees. And a trophic cascade occurs when one species has an influence on another species that is at a non-adjacent trophic level. Okay, so the trees and the fungi are, in an order of trophic levels, and the salmon is at another trophic level, but the tree and the salmon are actually interacting directly. These trophic cascades, you can think of them as a waterfall, right? That there's this rapid interaction, and even though there's intermediaries, those effects can be very direct, even without the mycorrhiza in between. Okay, so a trophic cascade then is when one trophic level influences a non-adjacent trophic level. So here the salmon, sorry, I got it backwards in when I didn't show the levels here, but here the salmon and the trees are directly interacting, even though there is an intermediate trophic level, the soil biota, the biology, the salmon and the trees are also like very, very much interacting, even without, and even sometimes bypassing that soil biology level. Okay, so, but those interactions, they happen very quickly, like a waterfall, and these biota, soil biota, are involved as well, but it's just that it cascades so quickly these kinds of higher order interactions, because of its rapidity and its integration, are called trophic cascades. I'm not going to show you this video now, but it is a beautiful video about trophic cascades. I'll ask you to look at it on your own. It's actually an example of a trophic cascade in Yellowstone Park. It's beautifully shot and beautifully narrated. It's about 4 minutes long. And it's about when wolves were reintroduced back into Yellowstone Park, and how it resulted in a trophic cascade where the rivers were affected, the flow of the rivers, because when wolves were reintroduced, the prey base was changed, and this changed the vegetation along the rivers, which made the rivers more healthy. So it is a beautiful example, and I want you to look at it in your own time. Okay, so now I want to move now from these interactions to carbon and climate change and global change. And I showed you this picture last time. And this is where it's a really good example of how biodiversity and species interactions affect large-scale biogeochemical cycles like the carbon cycle. And I went through this example before, but basically showing that when you have a diversity of species in a forest, like in this picture on the right, that the different species are able to more fully utilize the resources in that ecosystem. So the different canopy shapes, shade tolerance levels, tolerance or ability to use resources in different abundances, different wavelengths of light, for example, quality of light. All these species more completely use that light profile. And below ground, because of their different rooting depths, their different mycorrhizal fungi, their different soil biotas, their unique habitats and niches, they're able to more fully capture the soil, water, and nutrients that are in the soil. And when they can do that, when the forest is full like that, all the niches are filled, the forest is more productive. And we've measured this in the Mother Tree Project, where total ecosystem carbon, or you can think of that as net ecosystem production, which is basically photosynthesis minus plant respiration minus heterotrophic respiration, if you remember that from back then, that it increases with tree species richness. We've measured this across the forests of British Columbia. And I mentioned, other people are now also measuring this in different forests around the world. It is becoming a well-known thing. And it's kind of funny, back when I became a forester, all we wanted to do, all the forestry companies wanted to do was just plant lodgepole pine. And because they thought, well, if we just plant lodgepole pine, we'll be able to harvest lodgepole pine. It'll be so much easier, so much cheaper, and we'll make so much more money. But what that did is it simplified the forest, and it made the forest less productive and actually more vulnerable to diseases and fire and all kinds of disturbances. That is not an isolated example in British Columbia. This happens all over the world when this misguided idea that if we simplify the forest, we'll make more money from it has happened in eucalyptus forests around the world. For example, in Portugal, in Ecuador, in Chile, there are these eucalyptus plantations being planted because they're fast growing, they're simple to manage, but they're also highly flammable, it turns out, and that reduces biodiversity, and it actually reduces the carbon accumulation in the forest. So, so it's really important. Biodiversity is so important in the global change picture. Here's another example. This is in a tropical rainforest. Down in the Amazon. And in this case, they were looking again at species richness, this time along the y-axis, carbon stocks along the x-axis. It's the same relationship. We found that in the temperate forests of British Columbia. They're finding it in the tropical rainforests of the Amazon as well. And so people are recognizing then that there are, economists will call it co-benefits. There's co-benefits between biodiversity and carbon accumulation. carbon accumulation is so important because we're trying to mitigate climate change, like drawing down CO2 levels so we can stabilize climate. But we cannot do that without good biodiversity, without, these ecosystems remaining diverse. And just to, and I encourage you to look at this article, but they're clearly able to illustrate this in the tropical rainforest and more studies around the world. This figure just kind of draws the linkages between, between climate change and biodiversity. So I know it's a really complicated picture, but I wanted to sort of expand your how we think about climate change is that it's really what we should be talking about is what's called global change. Climate change is part of global change, and these things are all interrelated and linked. So the global change in this figure is this middle line, the green circle, the green bubbles here. And global change includes biodiversity. It includes climate change. It includes changes to the water cycle, which Dr. Alila talked about a couple lectures ago. It includes all these other things that we're having, these knock-on effects we're having on effects of air, soil, water, the desertification of ecosystems. And these global change phenomena, which are all interrelated, all these little red lines show, they're all interrelated with each other. When we lose biodiversity, we also, it accelerates climate change. When the hydrologic system falls apart, we lose biodiversity and it accelerates climate change, so on. And all of these changes result from how we use resources. How we use energy, right? So fossil fuel burning drives climate change, which is linked to biodiversity loss. How we use water, how we use land, how we use all of these things is affecting these global change issues. And then these are the impacts of global change on ecosystems. Loss of ecosystem services, and that just means how does the ecosystem function? Its resilience, how is it able to recover from disturbances? I'll talk about that more in another lecture. Then all these other things, all these knock-on effects to humanity and the rest of the non-human world. All of these things are interrelated. And so, as we talk about biodiversity in this lecture, we're really talking about global change and its linkage to these other systems. Okay, so back to the Fairy Creek example. Some of you may have been involved in this. Certainly, I was involved. Even my children were involved to a degree in this issue because it's such an important issue around this topic that we're talking about. Fairy Creek, just if you haven't heard of it, it's a watershed that is just north of Victoria on Vancouver Island. It is one of the last untouched watersheds on southern Vancouver Island that has not been logged. It was it's kind of an interesting story, but when there's a company that was planning to log Fairy Creek, and they had been posting, or they're required to to talk or post their plans and publicly announce their plans for logging. And there was a young activist in Washington State, actually just south of the border, Joshua Wright, who was about 17 at the time, and he was he was a real computer geeky guy, and he was into conservation. He was an activist, and he noticed that they were starting to build roads into Fairy Creek, and that they were posting announcements of logging Fairy Creek. And so he actually activated his networks and said, we need to stop this because it is the last untouched watershed on southern Vancouver Island outside of parks. And so it ignited a protest, and thousands of people came to protest these plans to log Fairy Creek. It's a highly complex issue because Fairy Creek is also in the territory of the Pachidat and the Didadat nations. And they have, it is their territory that's been licensed out to the big companies to log. And they also are involved through various reasons to an extent in some of the logging. And that is because, these communities, the indigenous communities are very impoverished. And so they had they had gotten a loan from the BC government to build a mill, but that mill was configured for logging old growth forests. And so to pay off their loans to the BC government, they actually had to, have some of this logging as well. And so it was a highly, highly contentious, complex, very complex issue. Anyway, all that politics aside, and I encourage you to look into it because it just shows how complicated these issues are. It still resulted in Indigenous and non-Indigenous coming and converging on Fairy Creek to protest the logging of this beautiful watershed. And just to bring, not to put a finer point on it, it's crucial. This is the area around Fairy Creek. The logging has been extensive. Vancouver Island has, other than Northern Vancouver Island, which is being heavily logged to this very day, most of it has been logged already. This just shows how crucial it is. New clear cuts, old clear cuts, little bits of old growth left, but it's really critical. And in fact, a recent analysis was done on what is the remaining old growth forest in British Columbia, and there's really in the most productive valley bottom old growth, which are the most, along the rivers and streams where the salmon run, there's only about 1 to 3% of these forests left, and their habitat. So it's absolutely crucial from a climate change, a global change, biodiversity perspective that these places are protected. And that's why the protests happened. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of the news that came out at the time. There were some volunteer biologists who went into Fairy Creek over the concern about biodiversity in these old forests. This professor, Dr. Royanne Petrel, actually went in and did an analysis, and she discovered, along with some other biologists, that there are a number of endangered species, including the western screech owl. Their surveys yielded that there were 319 species, of which 16 were vulnerable or species of a concern for going extinct. They were able to they went in and did this, what's called a bio blitz, and they were able to make this list in about 20 hours, during which they were being obstructed by the RCMP at the time. It made it to the news, of course, and it raises this next part, important questions about, how we're all involved. The government is involved in letting out these licenses in the destruction of biodiversity and habitat here at Fairy Creek and elsewhere around the province. There was a survey done, it says here that it's less than 100 kilometers from Victoria, that the carbon sequestration capacity of Fairy Creek alone is enough to absorb all of the emissions from cars in Victoria in a certain period of time. It's absolutely crucial as a carbon sink for emissions from that city. It goes on to say this is not just a Fairy Creek problem. It's a pervasive problem across BC, and I would say not just BC, but Canada and the world. We talk about biodiversity while destroying untold hectares of forest habitat in the name of forest harvesting. We even have very weak legislation in British Columbia in species at risk. There's not that much in our legislation that protects these species. Okay, so let's go on a little bit. These are some of the species that were found that are at risk, and there's just a list. You can look at these things. The old growth speckled belly lichen is an obvious one. You walk into those forests and immediately they're there, but it's an endangered species. And the marbled murrelet, another endangered species that's well known to be an iconic indicator species of loss of habitat. It requires old growth forests to roost and have their nests, and then they fly out to the ocean and find their food and then come back. So absolutely crucial. There's a bunch of other ones here. I was fortunate that I was able to go into Fairy Creek right in the height of all this a couple of times. And this is actually at the headwaters. And this is an old tree here named Titania. The activists who were in the forest protecting these forests in the headwaters. It's at the headwaters. This tree they had named Titania. Titania is a yellow cedar that's about 3,000 years old. And this yellow cedar is kind of like a matriarch in the forest. Um, Through the mycorrhizal networks, we think that Titania is linked to almost all of the other trees in the neighborhood, and the plants as well. And so just a crucial connector, and also a very important, these headwater ecosystems, as Dr. Leela talked about, are really important in stabilizing the hydrology of these systems. And when we went into this area, there was actually a logging road that had been flagged right through Titania because they were going to log this entire headwaters. But the activists, were able to stop that. It's actually a good story at the end of the day. But, even as we were there, many things were going on. Not far from Titania, a group of journalists and I went in, and we found this other ancient yellow cedar tree in the adjacent watershed called Granite Creek. And we were able to go inside this tree. It turned out that this tree, this is just me inside the tree, is a den for bears. And so black bears would come and den in this when the snow came in the fall, and they would be fattened up on salmon, of course, because they're feeding on spawning salmon. They come and in October, and in the middle of the winter, they have their cubs. And then the cubs, in April, they all emerge, and then there's food and so on. So most of the bears actually on Vancouver Island, 90% of them den inside of old trees. They don't den in the ground. They den mostly in old trees. They protect them from the snow. They're warm. They're able to actually, make their space. This is a beautiful little room with a beautiful floor, and it's warm. And we could actually see on the wood the hairs of the old bears. Okay, so it turns out that, so this is just a picture of a bear that would have been feeding and then comes in and dens in that tree. It turns like when we were there, 2 weeks later, that tree was actually cut down. And so the den of that bear was destroyed. And so, and this is happening, all over Vancouver Island. So the logging itself is affecting the biodiversity and the trophic cascades of this region. And people protested, and it was a major thing. I think over 1,100 people were arrested in protesting against this. And at the end of the day, these protests went on for the entire summer. They went right into the fall of 2021. 1,100 people arrested. Some people thrown in jail, especially Indigenous women were especially targeted. I will say that, and young women especially targeted by the police. But many people were arrested. But you know what? There is a good ending to this story in that all of that resulted in this last election, the government that just got into power, the NDP government, alongside the Green Party, announced that they were going to provide permanent protection to the Fairy Creek watershed. So that took a long time. And I'm telling you the story because if you care about biodiversity and you care about climate change, these kinds of movements really do matter. And at the larger scale, just to, when I this cascades up to the whole global level. And I at the time that Fairy Creek was going on in these protests, they had just announced, or just shortly after announced, that our global circulation systems are changing because of climate change. And so what happens at Fairy Creek affects the whole world. It all ripples up to these and cascades up to these higher levels. Okay, you can look at this article on your own at a later time. And just to, come back to this, that, these blockades and these protests are unfairly targeting, especially Indigenous people. This is a woman, her camp name was Rainbow Eyes, Angela Davison, who is actually is a deputy leader of the Green Party, was actually arrested She was arrested 7 times. And she's actually was made an example of in the courts of of by the court system of this protest, and she's probably suffered the heaviest amount of incarceration and damages because of her protest. But she her worldview is that these ecosystems are essential to our lives, that we're all connected. We're all responsible for these ecosystems, and that it's essential that we stand up for them. Okay, so let's get back. Um, I hope that that illustrates to you how imperative it is that we understand biodiversity, that we fight for biodiversity, that it's all part of the global change picture. So biodiversity, what is it? It is actually the variety of life and its processes. And biologists like to carve it up in different ways. And it's kind of useful because there are many ways to think of biodiversity. The way we mostly think of it is compositional diversity. So what is the what is the variety of individuals, the variety of species, the variety of genotypes, even the variety of minerals, or the things that are left behind, the legacies in an ecosystem. Those are all considered components of the composition of diversity. Okay, and we can present that and say, oh, there's 10 species or 319 species of plants, animals, and bryophytes at Fairy Creek. Okay, that's an indicator of the diversity, the components, the species richness. Another way to look at biodiversity is the structure. So how are these species organized? And people will look at what we call the architecture of a forest. So the architecture is just the spatial or the horizontal and vertical structure of the forest. How many canopy layers are there, for example? How evenly are these species distributed amongst the different canopy layers or amongst the abundance of biomass out on that ecosystem? It's not just the numbers of species, it's how many they are and relative to each other. Okay, I'll come back to that next lecture. There's also another way we can look at biodiversity is the social structure. So food chains, food webs, guilds of species, which are consortiums of species that work together. These are also ways people will look at biodiversity. Sometimes they also will, kind of, gets a little bit more muddly, but think of not just the things, the species, but the functions that they serve. And so some biologists will speak of biodiversity in terms of the function, how diverse are the functions in that ecosystem. And these, have feedbacks to the structure. I know it's kind of like circular, but you can also think of the functional diversity. What is function? Function is just actions, like rates of things, like photosynthetic rate of water uptake. They tend to be things that happen over time. And function, these actions, when you hear the word process, these kind of mean the same thing, although people will split them apart. Processes at a finer scale, function is a more broader concept. But yeah, so function is another way that we can express biodiversity. Okay, but the most common way that people look at biodiversity in forests and other ecosystems is looking at species diversity. So let's go to this polling question. Oops.
Done. That's perfect.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's dig down into some of these components of biodiversity a little more deeply. Just quickly, just to review again, composition we usually express as by species, which is one of the many organizational levels of biodiversity. Species can be lumped together into genera, family, phyla, kingdom. So people will express biodiversity at those higher levels of organization as well. Even individuals, you can have a variety of individuals with different genotypes. People will also look at genetic diversity, for example. So genetic diversity is like kind of a subset of species or individual diversity, which can be expressed at population levels, individuals, all the way down to genes and nucleotides. And then at the other, even coarser scale, composition can be expressed as not just species or individuals or genes, but the diversity of niches that they occupy. The populations, you can have populations within a species that are, focused in an area where they're a self-reproducing population. You can also express this composition as just habitat. What is the habitat for screech owls on Fairy Creek? How diverse is that? How many habitats are there for that? Ecosystems, what is the diversity of different kinds of sites like mesic, xeric, or hygric, dry, wet, or medium, all the way up to biomes. So these are just different ways that people have expressed this diversity. But again, I come back to that usually we talk about species diversity as the simplest thing. Okay, so how then is this? I want to talk a little bit about how, what we mean about this other measure of diversity, which is the architectural structure. And how do we measure that? So this is just a picture of a forest. You can see there's trees that are taller, shorter, even down in the understory. That's vertical structure. You can see that there's a clump of trees here and a more opened area, a gap right here. That's an expression we can express that as horizontal diversity. So how do people do this? Well, they look at things like, foliage. You can go into any journal article and people will be expressing this architectural diversity in these different ways. What is the foliage distribution? What is its leaf area? What is its vertical distribution? You can even go down into the leaf shape and the size, and then what are the canopy gaps? What is the foliage like in those gaps? You can express it just by looking at tree crowns. What does the canopy cover? What's the shape of those crowns, the length, the diameter, and so on. People can even express architectural diversity just by, expressing about the bark. Bark is important because it's habitat for other species. They're scaffolds for biodiversity. I learned just recently that the old growth cottonwood forests in the subboreal forests up near Prince George, in a little bark crevice, there are 5 species of bats that live in those bark crevices, and they all occupy different portions of that bark crevice, kind of like MacArthur's warblers, occupying different niches in the tree canopy. Same thing in bark. We can also express diversity in terms of or architectural diversity in terms of the tree boles. How big are they? How wide? How tall are they? How old are they? Do they have decay in them, and so on? We can also look at it in terms of wood tissues. Standing dead trees are really important. Snags, because they're habitat for other species. They provide homes for cavity nesting birds like woodpeckers. And then all the other species that will come in and use those cavities after the woodpeckers have finished using them. Once they decay out and they become bigger and bigger and bigger, other species move in and use those cavities. So standing dead trees, the snags, are super important as habitat. Fallen trees, this is the stuff on the ground, that provides habitat as well, and people express that. How many what we call coarse woody debris is on the ground? What are the decay classes? What is living in them? And then the plant diversity in the understory, the shrubs, herbs, mosses, we look at these kinds of things. Forests, and then in the soil, what's in the soil? That's another whole habitat that's got incredible diversity in it, expressed by the forest floor. We talked a lot about this earlier in the course. The microsite topography, is there dips or there hummocks? The roots, the soil structure, and then at the bigger scale, the landscape structure. These are all aspects of architecture, and you can see the way I explained that, how that architecture is related to habitat and species diversity. Okay, so when you're looking at a diverse forest, what you're really looking at, the structure of that forest is you're looking at the result of the processes that are going on, the functions that are going on. In this old growth forest on the coast, coastal western hemlock zone, or the areas like in Fairy Creek, there's incredible structural diversity. We've got understory trees, we've got coarse woody debris along here, we've got trees of different species and sizes, we've got canopy layers. But what created that architecture is a number of processes. And when you think back to when we talked about disturbances and disturbance regimes, that creates this diversity. So here in this forest, we're saying that this forest would have initiated from some kind of disturbance. There would have been, soil and logs and plants left behind after that disturbance that seed into the forest. The forest starts to grow up. It goes through a process called self-thinning as the trees start to compete with each other. Younger trees or different species will come up underneath them, and that's what you're seeing right here. The forest has self-thinned a little bit. Some trees have died out, and it's making room for other species to come up. And then as the forest ages, you start to get these smaller level disturbances, old trees falling over or decaying, or a windstorm comes along, and it creates these fine scale gaps in the forest, which creates even more space for more biodiversity. And so an old growth forest, as it gets older and older, it is the most biodiverse place you can be. They get more diverse as time goes on because of all these fine scale disturbances. This list here is just sort of a chronological order of what I just explained: disturbance followed by establishment, canopy closure, and then you get self-thinning, which is this competitive due to competition, and you get the lower canopy losing its branches, and it prunes and it creates more space in the understory, and then you get the understory developing as more trees die out, and you start to get trees dying not just from shading, but by wind and disease. And you get canopy gaps initiating, and that generates coarse woody debris and some uprooting, which creates more microtopography. And then you get the understory coming in more and more and more and more shrubs and more herbs in these old growth forests. And eventually you get into these old forests that have lots of canopy elaboration, lots of layers. You got old trees that are dying with dead tops and multiple tops. Like think of an old growth cedar forest. You have very large branches, very large crowns. This is where the biggest carbon accumulation occurs in an ecosystem. Okay, so structure is linked to process then. I hope that slide shows that for you. Okay, so as I explained in that previous picture, that it is really these fine scale disturbances that create that diversity. In this forest, this old growth forest, you have all kinds of, this is height and leaf area. You've got leaves and plants at all kinds of levels. And it's because of these fine scale disturbances. So before our break, we'll just get you do this last polling question here.
Done. Interesting distribution. 60% D. The remaining ABC is 10%.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so it's the fine scale disturbances that's creating this diversity in these old forests. Okay, so let's take a little break and we'll see you back here at noon. Thanks. Everybody, let's continue on. So just coming back to how the structural diversity of the overstory of a forest really affects the understory, the development and the diversity. So here I've got a figure that kind of matches with this picture on the right, where we have the vertical structural diversity. In this case, we've got Douglas fir in the upper part of the canopy. This is higher up in the canopy, and this is leaf area. That because Douglas fir is a shade intolerant species, it tends to occupy these upper layers as it grows up after a disturbance. hemlock, Tsuga heterophylla. And you'll have seen this when you're out in the forest in Pacific Spirit Park. It loves the shade, and so it grows in the understory of Douglas fir. And underneath that, we have another species, Abus amabilis, which is another shade-tolerant species in these forests, which can even exist below the hemlock. And even under that, we can have a very shade-tolerant species, yew, the Western yew taxus. And these are all these species are forming, because they're in different layers, different shade tolerance, they're forming different functions in that forest. And they're using the light that comes through, and it attenuates the light. Until when you get into the understory, you have all these other species, the shrubs. Here's a maple tree, for example. You'll have seen so many species in the understory in your photo journal assignment. And these species come in when if they really love shade, if they're very good at using very low light, or if there's a disturbance that's been created by these small fine scale disturbances, like a tree falling over, or a tree dying from a disease, or an insect infestation, or wind throw, or whatever it might happen to be. Okay, so another important aspect of the structural diversity in our forests and on the West Coast are epiphytes. And epiphytes are a really great example of how, they grow on trees. Their epiphyte means it's like growing on top of or on another plant, on the skin of another plant, epi. And these themselves will amplify biodiversity. So here we have these epiphytic lichens and mosses and other plants on this maple tree, and they're creating structure themselves. They're selective about where they grow. They'll grow on certain kinds of patches of bark where there's certain nutrients available. So they have that vertical structure. And they themselves will support other epiphytes. So on these licorice ferns, for example, you'll have other little, bacteria, fungi, and other little plants growing on top of them. And each time, these epiphytes will create more structure and more niches for other species. We tend to get a lot of epiphytes and a lot of other plants growing in the high crowns of trees, which is really interesting. If you ever get a chance to go up on a rope up to the crown of a tree, that's where there's a huge amount of biodiversity, a large numbers of epiphytes. How do they get there? Well, birds which eat seeds and other organisms will fly over, and they poop on the crowns, and then those seeds will germinate and sprout and become epiphytes on those trees. So you tend to get, for that reason, there's a lot of photosynthate there, a lot of energy, and a lot of propagules, and that got there through birds dropping on them. And this amplifies diversity. So we have a polling question. How do epiphytes amplify biodiversity?
Hmm. Around 65% answer correct, but like still 20% chose B and 10% chose C.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question.
Yeah,
I agree. So
right.
really what they're doing is they are creating niche spaces, but they are also symbionts, and they are also specific about their substrates. But what I was looking for is that they're creating these niche spaces. Okay, well, good. Thank you. Um, Okay, so and I mentioned I'm somebody who studies a lot of below ground structural diversity and species diversity, and it's an incredible place too, where there are different niches and connections and structures. And I just show you this example from a study that I did with a graduate student about 15 years ago. It's amazing how time flies, but we were and this builds on the mycorrhizal network work that I was talking to you about in an earlier lecture. But I'm just showing you this because in this map where we have the trees, which are these little Dr. Seuss-like green characters, and their connections to these different fungal genus. So they're individuals of fungi that are like widespread through the forest. And the pink ones in this case is one species. It's called Rhizopogon vesiculosus. You don't need to remember that. And the blue one is Rhizopogon vinicolor, another species. And it's just showing that these species are segregated, right? Like here's one individual genet here of vinicolor, and here's a vesiculosus here, and they're patterned through the forest. And then these trees are connected to these different fungal genets. So what I'm trying to show you here is there's a lot of structural diversity below ground, horizontal structured diversity. And these fungi are in these patterns because of the trees that they connect to, that they're symbiotic with. So the trees themselves are kind of dictating where these fungal genets occur, or they're at least interacting with them to influence it. Um, so that's a major pattern. Even when we look at the layers in the soil, so this picture on the right is just showing that the vinicolor and the vesiculosus, the pink and the blue, when we look at the depth of that their genets are in the horizontal, in the vertical space from a soil profile, so the 0 being at the forest floor and then 14 centimeters down into the mineral soil, that we get vinicolor in the top layers and we get vesiculosus in the lower layers. So not only are they horizontally structured, they're vertically structured in the soil as well. And where they occur is determined by what trees are around and that are feeding in and providing photosynthate for those mycorrhizal fungi. So anyway, the reason I'm showing you this is, like, in addition to that massive vertical and horizontal structure above ground, we have the same thing going on below ground, just a lot harder to study. Okay, so then, so we've talked about, about species diversity. We've talked about structural diversity. There's also this way or architecture, as a type of architecture. We've also got social structures in forests. So that's like the third way that we're looking at this architectural diversity. Okay, so social structures in forests, the way people look at these is through webs. So food webs, topological webs, and interaction webs, and I'll explain what those three things are. But they're really, these webs are organized, around the social structures between species, or the social interactions, the relationships. And it's really important when we're looking at that, it helps us understand the niche each species plays in that social structure, right? Who eats who? Who's the primary producer and who are the secondary and tertiary producers or consumers? These help us understand the ecosystem. It's just a type of social structure, these different webs. Okay, so, just to help us with some basics then, these social structures then, they're organized according to habitat and the niches that the species fill in them. Okay, so habitat and niche are two words that are very closely related to one another. A habitat is just a place that provides the food and the water and the protection for organisms to exist in. You can, we say that for a viable population, you have to have enough habitats for the species of that population to reproduce and carry on and have fitness into the future. And that habitat, the broader the habitat for that viable population, the more likely that it's going to be a viable population. So I put this little picture of Habitat for People. This is actually a structure that was built by Habitat for Humanity that houses a lot of different people. It's kind of like a little forest with all these different habitats for different kinds of people. Some people like to live at the top if they want to see far. Other people might want to live at the bottom because they like to go walk outside. All those different habitats, and they get the same thing in the forest. Okay, so that is what habitat is. Niche is not the habitat, it's the role of the ecosystem. So these things can become interchangeable and confusing, but a niche is really the functional role of a species within a system. And the functional role is what that species does. Is it, does it feed on bacteria and fungi, or does it feed on birds, or does it feed on higher predators? Is it an apex predator, or is it is it lower down in the food chain? That's its functional role. What is it doing? So we think of that as the niche. Or its functional niche. What's its function is also. So its niche is what it does, and we call that a functional niche. Some people also mix up the word habitat for niche. So a niche space can be the habitat that that species needs. Okay, it's that place where it lives. So it's not what it does. Some people think of it as where it lives. Where is its habitat? That's called habitat niche. And usually ecologists recognize that both of these definitions of niche exist, and we interchange them. So some people say, well, it's actually the interaction between the species and what it does and the habitat or the ecosystem in which it's embedded. Okay, so is this an example of the two ways that you can think of niche? So hemlock is in this little habitat. Sorry, it's in a little opening, and it's photosynthesizing in this gap. And so its function is to fill the gap and photosynthesize there in that little gap space. Okay, so its functional niche is as a shade-tolerant species that lives in gaps and increases the carbon sequestration of that forest, one of its many functions. Or you can think of that the gap itself is the niche. It's not the function of hemlock, but the gap itself is the niche for hemlock. Both of these things are okay, but that's how niche is used interchangeably. Okay, so how does niche happen, or how do we get niches, and how, what is this concept based on? It's harkens back to when I was talking about speciation. Niche comes from competition, or at least they say that it does. I think it comes from a multitude of interactions, but the classical definition is that it's based on what's called competitive exclusion. And it says that, no two species can occupy the same niche, exactly the same niche. That competition will lead them to separate their niche space. Just like it results in speciation, it also leads to competitive exclusion. They occupy their own separate niche space. They evolved to do that. So these two slightly separate, maybe slightly overlapping niches, we call that niche complementarity. But species can also overlap in some aspect of their niche. So hemlock doesn't just photosynthesize at low light. It has other niche jobs to do as well. For example, it's able to take up acidic forms of nitrogen in a very acidic forest. And so it's, from a taking up nitrogen point of view, it has a different role than it does when it's growing in the deep shade because it's shade tolerant. It's also an early snag developer. So it actually creates niche for woodpeckers early on in its life. So there it's got 3-dimensional space in its niche. And so it may be that hemlock will overlap with cedar in shade tolerance, but it definitely doesn't overlap with cedar with respect to the nitrogen species it takes up, or the ability to create snags for woodpeckers in the future. So they can overlap in some aspects, but then not others of their niche dimension. And this kind of niche overlap in one dimension or more dimensions of its niche space is important. It results in redundancy and stability in ecosystems, but it creates a lot of diverse functions. They can create, have multiple functions, even though a species might be overlapping with others in certain aspects. Okay, so I have a polling question here. what principle is the niche concept based on? And the answer is right in the title. It's based on the competitive exclusion principle. So here is our polling question.
Done.
Great. Thank you.
No worries.
All right. Okay, so this niche concept then is really essential for us to understand the social structures of biodiversity. And these things are organized, and I mentioned, in three kinds of different social structures, or at least people, ecologists think of food webs, topological webs, and interaction webs. So let me explain what those things are. So just a reminder that we're talking about, the social diversity, or the social diversity in an ecosystem. Why is it important? Why do we think about this? It's because of the functions that they are serving, and that this can be, we can think of species and how they fit into these structures according to their niche. What is their role? Where do they live? Okay, so one is a food web. We've talked about food webs quite a bit. Food webs are just social structures around eating. Who eats what? The food cycle. And, you know, this these food webs then, through this eating structure, integrates what species do and where they live. And this eating stuff, who eats who, involves creating their niche. What is their niche in that food web? Are you like a consumer, a producer, secondary consumer, so on? And then who are you eating? The feeding thing. And that feeding involves then the transfer of energy through the ecosystem, nutrients, flow of water. Okay, so the food webs are super important in how the cycles, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, this eating process involves things like, these interactions I talked about before, these plus minus interactions, predation, parasitism, herbivory, or even mutualisms. Okay, so this is just showing how, species are organized in these food webs, where we have on the left an above ground food web, where we have primary producers, which are our trees and plants, and they're eaten by herbivores, and energy flows from the trees into the herbivores, which then are eaten by carnivores, and then tertiary carnivores, or predators. Okay, and energy flows all the way up that ecosystem. It's a flowing of energy, of carbon being fixed and then dispersed through this ecosystem through the food web. Below ground, there's an equally complex food web going on. We have, again, the primary producers, and then we have the consumers that are eating the roots and the fungi and the bacteria, which are then eaten by larger organisms. And then we have energy flowing downward through these trophic levels. Or we can turn that upside down and say it's actually our primary producers are down here, and energy flows up into this, up towards the top predators. It's just turn it upside down physically. So so the basal species then are the green plants, and they don't eat anything, but they just produce, they photosynthesize. And then you also, in addition to herbivores and carnivores, we can also have omnivores, which will feed on more than one trophic level. So we can have this sort of like, we can have sort of trophic cascades within that food web too, where you're eating above your, more than one level, adjacent level above your position in the food chain. Okay, and this is just this is a food web that's below ground, and I'm not going to explain this, but just to say that, I've got all this information here, but and you can study this, but the point here is that below ground, it's invisible to us. We can't see it. It's super hard to study, but what people are discovering in these food webs, and here's our primary producers, and then here are our primary consumers, and so on, that they're really, really complicated. That we find that, These decomposers, that are right here, where they're feeding on dead plant material, they're feeding on dead animals, fecal material, and then they're providing the energy for all these primary consumers, the bacteria, all these shredders and fungi. And that even within these layers, you can have circularity where a species will feed within its own trophic layer, uh, and that you can get transfers laterally within a single trophic layer of the primary consumers. Um, we can describe these in all kinds of detail. People do. They look at linkage densities, connections, and all this stuff. If you want to be a below ground food web master, you can study these connections. Anyway, it's complicated. That is my main message. So those are food webs. We all can also people describe topological webs, and that's what I did with my grad student Kevin Byler, and we just basically mapped what the connections are between individuals or species just by looking at their horizontal patterns. So this is called a topological web. We didn't look at any kind of energy flows between species or individuals. We just looked at the connections. So that's a topological web. And these pictures are just of the fungal species Rhizopogon, which is a below ground truffle forming species that forms these webs that connect the plants together. That's what they look like. And this is the forest of this particular map. Okay, then a third kind of web is called an interaction web. Oh, I've gone over the time. Sorry. So I'll just end here and say that there can also be these webs of interactions where we actually quantify the energy flows between the species, and we can depict this in not just the species and their location on the food web, but how much energy is flowing between the different predators and consumers. So I'll just leave you with this last polling question. What type of social structure indicates the strength of interaction between species? And it is the interaction. So I'll just tell you the answer to that. And yeah, we can start that.
I'm thinking should we start this polling question since like some student is running for another class now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's okay. We don't have to
yeah.
do this.
Maybe just let them know the answer and yeah.
Yeah, on their own. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks everybody for your patience. I didn't realize I'd gone over. Okay.
Yeah.
Take care. Have a good afternoon.
Bye. Safe travel.
Bye. Thank you. You too.
Bye.
See you.